Most people don't know the exact taste of their own death. For Lisa Bishop, it didn't taste like copper, bitter chemicals, or the metallic tang of a warning. It tasted like the cloying, caramel sweetness of a Coca-Cola, served with a side of marital devotion. In the quiet corners of Wayne County, Indiana, a murder was being committed in slow motion, one sip at a time, under the guise of a husband's care. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Richmond, Indiana, is a city built on the bones of industry. Once a thriving hub of the Rust Belt, it is now a landscape of weathered Victorian homes, fading brick facades, and a quiet, persistent struggle against economic decline. For the residents of East Wallace Road, life moves at a deliberate, predictable pace. It is the kind of neighborhood where neighbors recognize each other's cars, and the sound of a lawnmower is the only weekend soundtrack. This was the world of Lisa Bishop, a 51-year-old woman whose life had become a series of internal and external boundaries. Lisa was a woman who understood the weight of dependency. Living with a disability that confined her to a wheelchair, her world had physically shrunk to the dimensions of her 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. In this domestic space, her husband, 69-year-old Alfred Ruff, was more than just a partner. He was her lifeline. He was the one who navigated the high shelves, the one who assisted with her daily routines, and the one who managed the small, essential details of a life lived with limited mobility. To any passerby, they were a couple entering their twilight years, navigating the challenges of aging and illness with the stoicism typical of the Midwest. However, in late 2021, a new and terrifying variable entered Lisa's life. It wasn't a sudden accident or a traumatic injury, but a gradual, soul-crushing erosion of her health. It began with a fog, a persistent, heavy drowsiness that seemed to settle over her brain like a thick Indiana mist. First, it was easy to dismiss. Perhaps it was the change in seasons, a side effect of her existing medications, or simply the exhaustion that comes with chronic disability. But the fog didn't lift, it deepened. By October, the drowsiness was accompanied by agonizing, rhythmic headaches that felt as though her skull was being squeezed in a vice. Then came the gastrointestinal distress, violent bouts of diarrhea and nausea that left her physically depleted and dangerously dehydrated. Between September and December of 2021, Lisa Bishop's life became a revolving door of emergency room visits and hospital stays. On 6 separate occasions, Lisa was rushed to the hospital. Each time, the scene was the same. A woman in her early 50s, pale and lethargic, struggling to explain why her body felt like it was shutting down. The medical staff at the Wayne County hospitals were diligent. They ran comprehensive blood panels, performed CAT scans, and monitored her heart rate. They looked for the usual suspects: tumors, rare autoimmune flare-ups, or perhaps a localized infection that refused to heal. The mystery baffled the doctors. Each time Lisa was admitted to the sterile, controlled environment of the hospital, she would begin to improve. Away from the routines of East Wallace Road, the fog would lift, her headaches would subside, and her strength would slowly return. Believing she was on the mend, the doctors would discharge her back into the care of her devoted husband. And every single time, within days of returning home, the symptoms would return with a vengeance. Lisa was living in a terrifying loop. She was a woman trapped in her own body, watching her vitality slip away while the experts shook their heads in confusion. She began to wonder if she was dying of something so rare that medical science didn't have a name for it yet. She had no way of knowing that her recovery in the hospital wasn't due to the medicine they were giving her. It was due to the medicine she wasn't receiving while she was there. Throughout this ordeal, Alfred Ruff was the picture of a concerned spouse. He was the one who sat by her bed, the one who spoke to the doctors, and the one who made sure she was comfortable once they returned home. In the social fabric of Richmond, an elderly man caring for his younger, disabled wife earns a certain level of respect. It is an image of traditional loyalty that few would think to question. But behind the closed doors of their East Wallace Road home, the care Alfred provided was far more calculated. While Lisa slept or struggled through her headaches, Alfred was busy. He wasn't just managing the household, he was managing a dosage. He was observing the effects of the substances he was slipping into her food and drink, acting as a grim chemist in a domestic laboratory. The betrayal was total. Every time Lisa thanked him for a glass of water or a soda, she was unknowingly participating in her own destruction. The very person she relied on to help her ambulate and navigate her disability was the one ensuring she was too weak to ever leave her bed. This wasn't a crime of passion, it was a crime of persistence. It required Alfred to look into his wife's eyes every day, see the suffering he was causing, and decide to do it again the next morning. The breaking point finally arrived on a nondescript day in January 2022. By this point, Lisa had become hyper-aware of her environment, a survival instinct finally kicking in through the haze of her drugging. She was finished with the hospitalizations and the lack of answers. She began to pay closer attention to her symptoms and what preceded them. She was sitting in her wheelchair, drinking a can of Coca-Cola that Alfred had provided. As she reached the bottom of the can, she tilted it back to get the last sip. That's when she felt it. A gritty, chalky texture that shouldn't have been there. It didn't dissolve like sugar. It felt like fine sand against her teeth. Lisa didn't just swallow it and move on. She peered into the opening of the aluminum can. There, settled in the dark syrup at the bottom, was a distinct, white, powdery sludge. In that moment, the 6 hospitalizations, the unexplained headaches, and the chronic drowsiness all aligned with a sickening clarity. The medical mystery wasn't internal. It was being poured into her cup. She didn't call 911 immediately. She didn't scream. Instead, she confronted the man who had been her world. She showed him the can. She demanded to know what was in her drink. In a move that displayed either a staggering lack of guilt or a complete break from reality, Alfred didn't deny it. He didn't make up a story about a contaminated batch of soda. Instead, he walked away and returned with a pill bottle. Inside the bottle was the same white, powdery substance Lisa had found in her Coke. It was the physical manifestation of months of torture. Alfred held the bottle as if it were a mundane household item, a gesture that signaled the end of their marriage and the beginning of a criminal investigation that would shock the state of Indiana. As Lisa stared at the pill bottle in her husband's hand, she realized she had been sleeping next to a man who wanted her dead. But as the police arrived to take Alfred into custody, the story shifted from a simple case of domestic poisoning into a dark web of sexual trade and a conspiracy involving the one person Lisa thought she could trust even more than her husband. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. The transition from the domestic quiet of East Wallace Road to the sterile, high-contrast environment of an interrogation room is a jarring one. For Alfred Ruff, the 69-year-old man now sitting under the hum of fluorescent lights, the shift seemed almost negligible. He didn't look like a master manipulator or a cold-blooded killer. He looked like a man who had simply run out of road. As detectives prepared their recording equipment, they weren't just looking for a confession. They were looking for the logic. How does a man in his 7th decade of life decide to systematically erase his wife? The answer Alfred provided would turn a standard attempted murder case into one of the most bizarre and sordid investigations in the history of Richmond, Indiana. The interrogation began with the basics. The pill bottle. Alfred didn't play games with the investigators. He confirmed that the substance Lisa found in her Coca-Cola was the same substance he had been administering for months. He described it simply as the white stuff. He didn't know the chemical names and he didn't care. To him, it was a tool provided for a specific purpose. Detectives pressed him on the frequency. How many times, Alfred? With a chilling lack of hesitation, he estimated he had drugged Lisa at least 12 times over the span of 3 months. He spoke about it as if he were discussing a recurring chore, like taking out the trash or mowing the lawn. He explained that he would wait for the right moment, sprinkle a little bit of the crushed pills into her soda or water, and then watch. He watched as the woman he had promised to protect grew heavy-lidded. He watched as her speech slurred. He watched as she eventually slumped into a state of chemical unconsciousness. But the investigators knew that even the most callous criminals usually have a why. Was it a life insurance policy? Was it the burden of being a caregiver? Alfred shook his head. The motive wasn't about what he wanted to get rid of. It was about what he was being promised in return. This is where the narrative took a sharp turn into the surreal. Alfred claimed he wasn't the architect of the plan. He cast himself as a participant in a scheme orchestrated by two much younger women. The first, he claimed, was Lisa's own 31-year-old daughter. The second was her friend, a woman named Sarah. According to Alfred, the daughter didn't just suggest the poisoning. She provided the materials. He told detectives that she would bring him the pill bottles, already filled with the crushed powder, and give him his instructions. The goal, as Alfred understood it, was to get Mom out of the picture. He alleged that the daughter was motivated by a combination of resentment and greed, eyeing a life insurance policy and the money from a recent real estate transaction the Ruffs had completed. But why would Alfred, a man who had lived nearly 70 years without a criminal record, agree to kill his wife for his stepdaughter? The answer he gave was a devastating look at elder vulnerability and the dark side of human desire. Alfred claimed the women had set a trap for him, a honey trap. In Alfred's version of events, the white stuff was the currency in a horrific trade. He told the investigators that in exchange for drugging Lisa, the daughter and Sarah would provide him with sexual favors. He described a barter system where the poisoning was the price of admission for a show. The details he provided were as specific as they were sickening. He claimed that once Lisa was drugged into a deep, unresponsive sleep, the two women would come to the house. While the victim lay unconscious in the next room, poisoned by the hand of her husband, Alfred claimed he would engage in sexual acts with the younger women. He even alleged that they would mock Lisa during these encounters, sometimes wearing her clothes or using her personal items to rouse him, turning the home of a disabled woman into a theater of betrayal. They kept wanting to have a sex wedding, Alfred muttered during the interrogation, using a phrase that suggested a warped, cult-like promise of a future together. He claimed the women told him that once Lisa was finally dead, one of them could marry him, and they would all live off the inheritance. To the detectives, it sounded like a classic case of a man being played by predators who recognized his age, his isolation, and his fading health as an opportunity. The detectives pushed Alfred on the ultimate goal. Did he realize that putting her to sleep would eventually mean she never woke up? You knew what you were giving her was eventually going to kill her, correct? The detective asked, his voice steady. Correct, Alfred replied. He didn't flinch at the word kill. He admitted that the plan discussed with the women was for the doses to gradually increase or continue until Lisa's body simply gave out. He knew the 6 hospitalizations weren't accidents. They were trials. Each time Lisa survived a hospital stay, it was merely a delay in the ultimate objective. Alfred admitted he was involved with it and expressed a hollow wish that he had never been, but he didn't deny his agency. He was the one who stood in the kitchen. He was the one who stirred the powder. He was the one who handed the cup to a woman who couldn't walk away. He described the daughter as the head of it, the one pulling the strings and charging him money, roughly $150 per visit, in addition to the requirement that he keep her mother drugged. It was a parasitic relationship where Alfred was being bled dry financially and morally, yet he continued to participate for the fleeting attention of women 40 years his junior. While Alfred was talking, the forensic side of the investigation was beginning to catch up. The white stuff wasn't a mystery for long. Laboratory analysis of the powder and Lisa's blood samples revealed a dangerous cocktail of prescription medications. Specifically, the mixture contained high doses of benzodiazepines, sedatives, and blood pressure medications. In a healthy individual, these drugs are dangerous in high doses. For a woman like Lisa, who was already dealing with physical disabilities and likely on other medications, this was a lethal recipe. The sedatives would knock her out, while the blood pressure medication would drop her vitals to dangerously low levels, explaining the unexplained hospitalizations where her body seemed to be fading for no reason. It was a clean way to kill, a method that looked like a natural failure of a fragile body rather than a violent act of murder. As the interrogation wrapped up, Alfred Ruff seemed to believe that by coming clean about the women's involvement, he was somehow mitigating his own guilt. He portrayed himself as a man who was along for the ride, a victim of his own desires and the women's manipulation. He didn't seem to grasp the gravity of the charges that were being prepared. He asked the officers what he was being charged with, almost as if he expected to be sent home after giving his statement. When the detective told him the charges, attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder, Alfred's only response was a weak protest. "My plan was not to murder her." It was a staggering contradiction to the confession he had just spent hours providing. The police now had a confession and the drugs. They had a motive and a method. But as they moved to arrest the daughter and her friend, they discovered that Alfred Ruff's truth was the only version of the story that existed. Without physical proof of the women's presence or a single text message confirming the plot, the investigators were about to realize that the person they thought was a pawn might be the only one who would ever pay the price. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. As the iron doors of the Wayne County Jail closed behind Alfred Ruff, the investigation into the Wallace Road poisoning took an unexpected and frustrating turn. Detectives had a confession that read like a dark thriller, a tale of sex for poison trades, elder manipulation, and a daughter's cold-blooded betrayal. But in the world of criminal law, a confession is only as strong as the evidence that supports it. As the search warrants were executed and the digital footprints of the accused were scrutinized, the case began to dissolve into a he said, she said deadlock that would define the justice gap of this tragedy. The first priority for investigators was corroborating Alfred's claims about Lisa's daughter and her friend, Sarah. If Alfred's story was true, there should have been a trail. They looked for the digital breadcrumbs that define modern conspiracies. Text messages coordinating the delivery of the white stuff, GPS pings placing the women at the East Wallace Road home during the times Lisa was drugged, or financial records showing the $150 payments Alfred claimed to have made. The results were a devastating blow to the prosecution's case against the alleged accomplices. When the daughter was brought in for questioning, she didn't crumble. Instead, she offered a vehement denial that countered every pillar of Alfred's statement. She denied the sexual relationship, she denied providing the crushed pills, and her attorney pointedly argued that Alfred was a confused, elderly man attempting to shift the blame for his own horrific actions onto his family. Without physical evidence, no fingerprints on the pill bottles other than Alfred's and Lisa's, and no recorded conversations, the investigators were at a standstill. In American jurisprudence, you cannot convict someone based solely on the uncorroborated testimony of a co-conspirator who has a vested interest in reducing his own sentence. To the law, the daughter and Sarah were ghosts in the narrative. They existed in Alfred's confession, but they didn't exist in the evidence. This left the community with a lingering, bitter question. Was Alfred a solitary monster, or were the true architects of this plan walking free because they were smarter than the man they manipulated? As the state prepared its case against Alfred, they began to dig into the background of the Ruff marriage, looking for the baseline of their relationship. What they found was not a story of a peaceful retirement interrupted by a sudden urge to kill. Instead, they uncovered a marriage that was defined by a long-standing, volatile cycle of domestic instability. The police department in Richmond was already intimately familiar with the house on East Wallace Road. Over the years, officers had been dispatched there for numerous domestic disturbance calls. These weren't just verbal arguments. They were snapshots of a relationship that had been simmering with violence for a long time. The most shocking revelation came from an incident approximately 1 year before Alfred's arrest. In a bizarre and violent role reversal, records indicated that Lisa Bishop had allegedly used her vehicle to run over Alfred during a heated dispute. The man who was now accused of poisoning his wife had, just months earlier, been the victim of a potentially lethal assault at her hands. This history of mutual combat transformed the narrative. It moved the case away from the predatory husband versus innocent victim trope and into the murky territory of a toxic cycle. For the defense, this was a goldmine. It allowed them to frame Alfred not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a man trapped in a high-stress, abusive environment, a man whose gullibility made him an easy target for anyone offering an escape, even if that escape came in the form of a pill bottle. With the accomplices out of reach and the history of domestic violence out in the open, the focus shifted to Alfred's mental state. At 69 years old, Alfred was dealing with his own declining health. His defense team argued that his cognitive functions were not what they once were, suggesting that he was a prime candidate for undue influence. They painted a picture of a man who was overwhelmed by the demands of caregiving for a disabled spouse in a volatile marriage. In this weakened state, they argued, he was susceptible to the honey trap he described. Whether the sex for poison trade was a literal reality or a fragmented delusion born of loneliness and elder cognitive decline became a point of intense debate. However, the prosecution remained focused on the mechanics of the crime. Regardless of who suggested it, Alfred was the one who performed the physical act. He was the one who stood in the kitchen and watched the powder dissolve. He was the one who handed the cup to a woman who was already physically vulnerable. The justice gap wasn't just about the people who weren't charged. It was about the difficulty of weighing a man's admitted actions against his claimed motivations. As the trial date approached, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office faced a difficult choice. To pursue an attempted murder conviction, they had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Alfred had the specific intent to kill. While his confession included the word correct, when asked if he knew the drugs would eventually kill her, a skilled defense attorney could argue that he was simply agreeing with a leading question from a detective. The history of Lisa running over Alfred with a car added another layer of complexity. A jury might see a cycle of violence and feel a misplaced sense of sympathy for a man they viewed as equally a victim in a broken home. This is the reality of the legal system that true crime viewers often find the most frustrating. The truth of what happened often takes a back seat to what can be proven and how a jury will perceive the characters involved. The daughter remained a free woman, never facing a courtroom for the allegations Alfred leveled against her. Sarah, too, remained in the shadows. Alfred Ruff sat in his cell, the only person wearing a jumpsuit, the only person whose life was officially on pause. He had traded his wife's safety for a fantasy, and now he was realizing that the people he thought were his partners in crime had no intention of standing by him when the lights came up. With the weight of a life sentence looming and the prosecution's case complicated by a history of mutual abuse, a deal was struck behind closed doors. But when the judge finally read the sentence aloud, it wouldn't just shock Lisa Bishop. It would ignite a debate about whether the justice system protects the disabled, or if it simply looks for the easiest way out of a complicated story. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. In the judicial system, there is often a vast, echoing canyon between what a person deserves and what the law can practically provide. For Lisa Bishop, the resolution of her case would not come in the form of a dramatic trial or a life sentence for her husband. Instead, it would be settled in the quiet, paper-heavy environment of a plea negotiation. As the summer of 2024 approached, the Wallace Road poisoning reached its legal conclusion, leaving the community of Richmond to weigh the value of a human life against the complexities of a broken legal system. The original charges against Alfred Ruff were staggering: attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. These are the heaviest labels the state can place on a person's actions, carrying the potential for decades behind bars, effectively a life sentence for a man in his early 70s. However, as the prosecution surveyed the battlefield, they saw the obstacles detailed in the previous months. They saw the justice gap regarding the daughter, the lack of digital evidence, and the messy, violent history of a marriage where both parties had been aggressors. Fearing that a jury might find enough reasonable doubt to acquit on the higher charges, or perhaps fearing that Alfred's age and health would garner undue sympathy, the state of Indiana offered a deal. Alfred Ruff agreed to plead guilty to a single count of aggravated battery, a level 3 felony. By accepting this plea, the more intentional charges, the conspiracy and the attempt to kill, were dismissed. The narrative shifted from a man trying to murder his wife to a man who had merely caused her serious bodily harm. For Lisa, this was a bitter pill to swallow. The man who admitted to poisoning her 12 times, the man who watched her slowly fade into chemical unconsciousness while he engaged in a sordid trade for sex, was no longer being legally pursued as a murderer. The sentencing hearing in August 2024 was the final act of this domestic tragedy. In the courtroom, the judge had to balance the horrific nature of the crime against the reality of the defendant. Alfred Ruff stood before the court, no longer the defiant or gullible man from the interrogation tapes, but a 73-year-old with failing health. The judge handed down a sentence of 9 years. On the surface, 9 years for 12 attempts on a wife's life seems a light sentence. However, the true price was revealed when the judge applied the mitigating factors. Because Alfred had no prior criminal record before this incident, because he had expressed remorse, and because he had cooperated fully with the investigation, even though his claims against others couldn't be proven, the judge suspended 5 years of that sentence. The final calculation was startling. Alfred Ruff would serve just 4 years in a correctional facility. This was followed by 5 years of probation. In the eyes of the law, the 12 separate occasions he chose to poison Lisa were condensed into a 4-year stay in a prison cell. For many observers, this was a failure of the system to protect a disabled victim. For others, it was the only logical conclusion for a case with so much gray area. While the prison time may have seemed brief to the public, the court-ordered probation was designed to be a leash that would last the rest of Alfred's life. The conditions were strict and unforgiving. Upon his release, Alfred is barred from ever having contact with Lisa Bishop again. He is a man who must live the remainder of his years in a state of forced exile from the woman he almost killed. The court also mandated 100 hours of community service and required him to undergo regular substance abuse testing, despite his primary weapon being prescription pills rather than illegal narcotics. He is prohibited from leaving the state of Indiana without written permission and must consent to searches of his person and property at any time. He is essentially a ward of the state, living under a microscope as a consequence of his sex-for-poison barter. One of the most significant conditions of his plea, however, was a requirement for truthful testimony. Should the state ever find the corroborating evidence they need to charge the daughter or her friend, Alfred is legally bound to testify against them. He remains the state's only witness, a living piece of evidence kept on a shelf, waiting for a day of reckoning for the alleged accomplices that may never come. Today, the house on East Wallace Road is no longer a site of active crime, but it remains a monument to a terrifying betrayal. Lisa Bishop survived the white stuff at the bottom of her Coca-Cola can, but survival is not the same as healing. She lives with the knowledge that her dependency was weaponized against her and that her husband valued a show from younger women more than her very existence. As for the daughter and the friend Sarah, they remain in the community, uncharged and unbowed. The law's inability to touch them remains the most controversial aspect of the case. Did Alfred invent the conspiracy to save himself? Or did he tell the truth, only to find that the truth isn't enough to secure a conviction without a paper trail? The case of Alfred Ruff serves as a dark warning about the intersection of elder vulnerability and domestic toxicity. It reminds us that the most dangerous predators aren't always strangers in the dark. Sometimes, they are the people holding the cup, sitting in the chair next to us, and promising to take care of us until the very end. In Richmond, Indiana, the story of Lisa and Alfred is over. The price of her life was set at 4 years in a cell and a lifetime of probation. Whether that price was just as a question that the legal system has answered, but one that the court of public opinion will be debating for years to come. You've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every story is told with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more fact-based true crime stories like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember, the truth is never buried.